What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I'm going to be sharing a good handful of beginner tips for XDefiant to help get you on your feet if you are struggling with the game at the moment, or even for those players that are performing just fine but are still fairly new to the game, you may pick up a few tips here as well. And let's just dive right into this with one of the more unique aspects of XDefiant compared to many other games like Call of Duty, which I know much of my audience will be coming from a Call of Duty background. This is the character abilities. It's very important in this game to understand what each character is capable of, what their abilities are, what their passives are, and what their ultimates are, as well as how to counter them. And I know this might sound super basic, but I also know there's many people that just don't bother with this stuff. The first tip I've got for you is just take a little bit of time in the menus to go to your factions and read the faction descriptions. This is the absolute bare minimum that you should be doing before getting into the game, so you can at least associate the different character models with what they're capable of. Now, of course, with that, you're not going to get all the details. You don't know all the intricacies of exactly how each of the abilities work and how the passives work. So to add to this point, if you're new to the game, another thing that I highly encourage you to do is play around with all of the factions. Even if you clearly have one faction that you prefer, their abilities just really suit what you like to do and your playstyle, at least toward the beginning, force yourself to use the other factions and use all of them, even the ones that you really don't want to use. Try them out, try their different abilities out as well. And the reason you want to do this is this just helps you understand what enemy players are capable of when they're using the various factions. That way, the moment you see a character model, you know exactly what they can do, what they can't do, as well as, very importantly, what their passive abilities are. And these are the areas I think you should focus on the most, or the passives, especially as beginner players, because when it comes to passives, they're always active. Every single time you run into a phantom character, so somebody that looks like one of these guys, you want to know that they actually have a little bit of extra health. They have 120 health rather than 100. Therefore, when you see them, just know you're going to have to hit a few more bullets against them to get a kill on them. Additionally, for these guys, the cleaners, when you're playing against them, just know they're actually dealing a little bit of extra damage to you over time. So there's a bonus burn damage that they apply to you every single time a bullet of theirs hits you. And that's pretty important to note as well. On the flip side of that, it's not just enemy character models you want to be aware of. You also want to be aware of your teammates' character models and what they're capable of doing. And a great example of this is the passive for the Libertad players. If you're not using Libertad and you've taken damage and you see a teammate nearby that is using Libertad, if the situation allows for it, try to get close to that teammate because getting close to them will trigger your healing. So understanding all of these little intricacies with not only the abilities and ultimates, but also the passive abilities, this can really go a long way into improving your gameplay over time with the game. The players that have a really solid understanding of what everyone is capable of doing at any given time, they're going to excel over the players that don't really bother learning that stuff. Additionally, on this same topic of abilities, I highly encourage you guys to try out the EMP grenades in this game. I know it's tempting to just use the standard frag grenade because you can get kills with them. They can be reasonably powerful actually if you can cook them properly. However, I don't see enough people using the EMPs, and EMPs can be excellent for shutting down enemy players' abilities. And this can often be much more impactful than just a simple frag grenade kill. So those are the basics when it comes to abilities. Next, let's talk about another really key thing with this game compared to some other shooters like Call of Duty. This is XDefiant has quite a slow time to kill, and this actually has quite a few implications as far as how you should be playing the game and approaching situations. The first important thing to note here is it is vital to really dial in those aim settings so that you feel comfortable with your aim. Now, if you are on controller, I did just recently upload a video with my best settings that I found for controller that I'm really comfortable with. And while of course you should be making adjustments for yourself, I do encourage you to check that video out because it at least explains many of the settings, and you can use my settings as a baseline and then adjust from there. And hopefully that'll get things feeling better for you so you can be more confident in your aim and your tracking ability. Since the slower the time to kill, the more important it is to focus on your aim rather than just your positioning. And just a note on aiming itself, if you're a controller player, make sure you're not just using your right analog stick in order to do all of your aiming for you. Left stick aiming is very important in this game, especially since we have reasonably fast strafe speeds, and therefore you should be using a combination of your right analog stick and your left analog stick to get on a target, and often that left analog stick is going to be the best for making those fine adjustments left and right on your target. The additional benefit with this will activate your rotational aim assist. As far as I can tell, it appears to work fairly similar to COD in that way. And another thing is, by keeping yourself moving, you're simply just making yourself a harder target to hit for enemy players. So you want to try to strafe back and forth in gunfights, not only to help correct your aim, but also to evade shots. Next, with games like XDefiant that have a slower time to kill, this means team play is rewarded much heavier. because it becomes far more difficult for even a really good player to kill multiple enemies that are attacking him at the same time. With a fast time to kill, that can be really easy. If you're a really good player, you can just snap between two targets, kill them before either of them can react. You can't do that super well on XDefiant, and especially as a beginner player, if you're struggling to win gunfights consistently, my recommendation is always try to keep yourself at least reasonably close to a teammate. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying you should literally be holding their hand and like touching a teammate at all times, because you'll just get in the way of them more often than not. But you want to stay at least somewhat close to them so they can help you with a gunfight, or you can help them with a gunfight at any given time. And doing that will really help stack the odds in your favor in situations, because you're more often going to run into a 2v1 situation rather than a 1v1 or a 1v2. Now, as you get more confident with the game, then you can start feeling a bit more comfortable to branch out and go a bit more lone wolf. But at least for the beginning, try to avoid that lone wolf playstyle. It doesn't work nearly as well in this game as it does in a game like Call of Duty. Now, continuing on this same thread of the slower time to kill, let's talk about headshots. In XDefiant, we have pretty solid headshot multipliers, and as a result, mixing headshots in with body shots is almost always going to be helping you in gunfights. So if you feel comfortable managing that, try to mix those headshots in, and you should find that you're able to win gunfights on a more consistent basis. However, since this is a beginner tip video, I do want to also say, if you're already having a hard enough time just hitting players in general, just hitting them in the body, focus on just shooting center mass. Just hit your target. Don't worry too much about the headshots at first. That's something you can develop over time as your confidence in your aim improves over time. And I actually feel exactly the same when it comes to integrating movement techniques into your gunfights. Now, like I said earlier, you always want to try to strafe in gunfights. That's basic beginner things that anybody can do. You do want to make sure you're at least moving a little bit left and right while in a gunfight. But then on top of that, once you start feeling more comfortable, implementing things like slide jumps or air strafing, where you're jump shotting, but not just a regular jump shot, you're jumping and then changing direction mid-air, or even just mixing the odd crouch in while you're in the middle of a gunfight. All of these things, when performed properly, will definitely help you win gunfights, especially in this game. I find the movement in gunfights can make a huge difference. So I would recommend at least trying to dabble with various movement techniques in a gunfight if you can manage it. But just like with headshots, if this is just throwing you off and causing you to miss your target entirely and lose a bunch of gunfights, maybe just focus on the basics at first, really get those nailed down, and then you can move on to the more advanced movement techniques. And then finally, on this general topic of this game having a slower time to kill than many FPS games on the market, one of the most important attachments you can have on nearly any gun in the game is going to be some form of a magazine attachment. If possible, you always want to put on either an extended mag or a quick mag, just something that allows you to either reload faster or have a larger magazine. And now that we have that general topic covered, let's move on to the next section of this video, and this is quite simply focus on the general FPS fundamentals. These things aren't necessarily unique to XDefiant. Many of the skills that I'm going to talk about here, they transfer between most FPS games, or at least many FPS games. But at the end of the day, these things are probably the most important things to focus on in this video in general, because if you don't have a good foundation of these skills, you're always going to be limited in how far you're able to improve. And the first big thing to talk about here is the minimap. That thing on the top left corner of your screen, that is the most important tool in your arsenal. It's far more important than any of the abilities in this game, because it allows you to play the game beyond your immediate surroundings. It allows you to focus more on the big picture, so you can start anticipating things well before they actually happen. So never neglect this. You should be checking that minimap constantly throughout a match. And a big mistake a lot of beginners make is if they are even using the minimap at all, they're only using it to look for those red dots where the enemies are firing an unsuppressed gun. And that's just one small element of the minimap. It's just as important, if not more important, to pay attention to your teammates' locations as well as the direction that they're looking in. You always want to be looking for holes in your team setup. If there's a lane that's just uncovered by one of your teammates, you probably want to go fill that lane and take up that role for yourself. Or at the very least, just be well aware of the fact that an enemy could come through that lane uncontested at any moment, so you have to be prepared for a fight on that lane. Additionally with that, you can see where teammates recently died on the minimap in XDefiant. That's very important because that means there's almost definitely going to be an enemy coming from that position. And the minimap is going to be your primary tool for reading spawns, which is the next section. Try to actively focus on respawns as you're playing the game. This is another huge tool if you want to start playing the game beyond your immediate surroundings and have that big picture in your head. Now, this is something that quite simply just takes time and experience with the game, although with XDefiant, I find the spawn system to be quite intuitive overall. It doesn't take that long to at least get a basic general feel for how the spawns are working in most of the game modes. So just a couple tips with this to help you learn the spawns a little bit faster. First off, like I said, the spawns are quite intuitive in the sense that if you see a teammate pop up on your mini-map, within XDefiant, this almost always means that the enemy team is spawning on the exact opposite side of the map. So if you're pushing way up on the map, for instance, toward where the enemy spawn was, but then you notice a teammate pops up there suddenly, that means the spawns have flipped. You want to turn around, the enemies are coming from the other direction. I know that may sound super basic for you guys, but this is a beginner tip video. Another big thing that helps accelerate the process of learning spawns is not just looking out for enemy spawn locations, pay attention to where you spawn. Every single time you die and respawn, take note of that exact position where you spawn, because then when you find yourself on the opposite side of the map killing enemy players, they're going to be using those same spawn points that you were previously using. And this is an excellent method for mapping out the spawn locations on a map, especially for beginner players, because beginner players tend to die a fair amount. So just treat every one of those deaths as a learning experience. Every time you hit that respawn button, don't just mindlessly start sprinting forward. Just take a brief moment to take note of where you spawn, and maybe even the general conditions surrounding that spawn. Where are your teammates located? Where are the enemies that you know about at least located when you spawn in that point? Do you have somebody pushing really hard on one side of the map, pushing your spawn over to the opposite corner without forcing a full spawn flip? By paying attention to these things, you start to learn the limits of how hard you can push a spawn before it flips. Or you start to realize if you spawn in one particular area, that means that you definitely have an enemy pushing on another area of the map, even if you had no knowledge of that enemy there. Just the sheer fact that you spawn in that location can actually give you quite a bit of information about the big picture of what's going on in the match in that moment. Next, when it comes to the FPS fundamentals, a big thing is get yourself out there and in the action. The more you expose yourself to a wide variety of situations, the faster you'll be able to improve. If you're the type that's too scared to get out there, you end up just sitting in corners, picking off free kills from unsuspecting enemies running by. Sure, at the end of the game, you might end up with a higher kill-death ratio than you normally would doing that, but you're not going to get any better at the game doing that. You're not really getting yourself out there. You're not learning from those experiences. You're just sort of cheesing your way to a higher kill-death ratio, and there's a hard cap on how well you're going to do at that point. Now, in saying that, though, there is a balance to be found here. You also don't want to go too far to the other extreme, where you're literally just throwing yourself toward the enemy player without even thinking about what's going on around you, just to expose yourself to as many situations as possible. You still want to be making plans for how you want to push or how you want to approach a situation. You still want to be making sure that you're using cover as you're pushing up on the map. And as you're doing this, try out different strategies. If you're finding one strategy isn't working, try something different. If a new strategy starts working out well for you, well, maybe you start filling that role a bit more and working on optimizing that strategy and becoming even more consistent with it. And that leads me to the final basic fundamental tip here that I think is one of the most important things to keep in mind as a beginner trying to improve in an FPS game. And this is quite simply, learn from your mistakes and try to avoid immediately jumping to a scapegoat every time something goes wrong. Treat every death or every loss as a learning experience. Think about what you could have potentially done different, or at least something different you could have tried in that situation that maybe would have yielded a better result. And the next time you run into a similar situation, try that different strategy out. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But if it doesn't, there's just another learning experience and try something different again. So don't get yourself down because you're dying a bunch or losing a bunch of games. Treat those situations as learning experiences. And then that second part, don't jump to a scapegoat immediately. This is a huge thing that holds players back from improving. If every time you die, you're just looking externally for what caused that death that's out of my control, then at that point, you're just looking for excuses rather than learning from that situation and working on the things that you can change to improve. Now, I totally get it. There are sometimes things that are just completely out of your control. Oftentimes, the hit detection or connection experience is just awful, especially right now in the game's current state. Things can be really rough netcode-wise. And sometimes, straight up, there's literally nothing you could have done to prevent a death, for instance. In saying that, though, more often than not, even when you're in a bad connection scenario and you end up losing due to that connection, there are still things that you could have done to maybe stack the odds more in your favor, to the point where you could have come out on top despite the fact that the connection experience is awful. All you can really do is focus on the things that you can control and always try to look for the things that you could have controlled even when outside forces are working against you. If you find yourself consistently jumping to something else caused that situation to happen and there's nothing I could have done, you'll start to make a habit out of that. And once you reach that point, you're going to run into some big issues when it comes to improving as a player, because at that point in your mind, you're already perfect. There's nothing you could have done different. The game sucks. It's the game's fault. And that's going to put a hard cap on your ability to improve. And honestly, this is something you have to continually monitor over time. I still catch myself from time to time falling into that trap of just negativity and blaming everything externally, and it's important to recognize when this is happening and try to refocus on at least what you can control. And there we go. That is going to wrap it up for the top beginner tips to help you guys improve at XDefiant. And this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. For any of you guys that do feel like you're pretty comfortable with the game or you're quite experienced with the game, what other tips would you provide to beginner players to help them get a better feel over XDefiant? These can be specific to the game itself, or they could even be more general FPS tips. Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.